Welcome to the Healing My Parts podcast, a podcast dedicated to educating and raising awareness about dissociative identity disorder, also known as DID. We are your hosts, the system behind Healing My Parts, which also includes parts that function as a therapist and leader in a mental health niche space. We'll be sharing tips and tools that have helped us and many others, while also sharing insights from our own journey of living with the condition. We'll also be hosting guests for conversations to help educate, dispel myths, and most especially help those living with dissociative identities and professionals who treat the condition. Thank you so much for tuning in. And now, let's get healing. Welcome, everyone. We are so looking forward to today's conversation. We had the pleasure of meeting Amanda a couple of months ago, and it was just like this instant connection. They're so warm and caring, relatable, and passionate. We just really love talking with them and are so looking forward to continuing to nurture a friendship with them. From the moment we started talking, it was really clear that they have so much wisdom and passion to share that we couldn't honestly wait to have them on the podcast to share with all of you. So without further ado, welcome, Amanda. And what would you most like people to know about you?
Yeah, great. And we feel likewise. We've listened to many of your podcasts, and yeah, I felt that sense of connection too, as actually we do with some other members of our community, because that's one of the great things, as we've been talking about before, that now we have in our lives is the ability to connect online. So yeah, with us, well, where do we start? So here we are in 2024. Like you say, time is an interesting thing for people with DID, whether it's days, months, years, lifetimes. So the body is in our late 50s. And we didn't discover we were a system. Or other terminology back then. Actually, I'm not even sure we knew about the term system, for example, but this was in 2016. So late in life, really, relatively late in life, in our late 40s, we would have been then. And at the time we were working very, very hard in a kind of senior position in the dairy industry here in the UK. So we live in southern England, in a picturesque area called the Cotswolds. So for people that sort of think of those typical English villages and stone walls and that sort of thing, we live in the Cotswolds. So yeah, I guess our journey with being more than one started in 2016, and here we are 8 years in, and yeah, well, it's already been one hell of a journey. So yeah, and back then it was actually whilst we were working that we became aware of the first other self was actually the sense of a child crying in our head, which I think actually you might have referred to in one of your recent podcasts when you're talking about different forms of communication. So imagine the picture. We were kind of like, back then, we were in a marketing, communications, and in a strategy role. So we worked in the dairy industry for dairy farmers, and we were about to get on the stage because our industry was in crisis, and we were going to talk to a room of about 300 people about how to communicate in a crisis. This is kind of like a little bit of an irony, really. And because we used to front the issues for the industry, and the industry was in crisis over milk price, I was about to go on stage, and in the break before my presentation, I turned my phone on. And at that point, I was already seeing a therapist, but for different reasons, actually to do with my inability to stop working and the exhaustion I was facing. And I turned my phone on, and it was a message from my therapist saying they weren't able to see me. She wasn't able to see me that night. And also I had lots of other messages from BBC journalists, and, like, in other words, the pressure was building, but pressure that previously I hadn't even touched the surface. But it was the message from the therapist that I know now triggered some abandonment reaction in me. And so I was stood there in this hallway waiting to go on in the coffee break, and all I could hear was a child crying. And I was amongst adults. So I was literally looking around me to try and find the child. And of course, there was no child, no visual child. So the call came, as in the call for me to go on stage. I was there with a child crying in my head. I now know I was dissociative. I was kind of, everything was swimming. I didn't know what was happening. I got on the stage. I did my presentation. I have no idea how I got through it. And I came off not knowing what I'd said. Apparently, I did pretty well. And that was it. That's when one of our youngest selves made themselves known. Yeah.
And therein lies the beginning of the journey, right?
Yeah.
I was just thinking too, as you were talking about getting on stage and, now knowing that you were dissociative and basically quote, I heard I did pretty well. I'm thinking, thank goodness for the parts that just show up and do what they know how to do. So it's almost like sometimes whether you understand your system or not, sometimes the system just runs on autopilot, thank goodness.
Oh, very definitely. And actually this was another one of it, just shows I listen to a lot of podcasts kind of when we can't sleep at 3 o'clock in the morning. But what's great about that is I'm then actually an avid listener of your podcast and many others. But I think it might have been Adrian that was talking about, it was talking about, they were talking about grieving their work self. And it's led us to question whether Amanda, that we're talking to now, was I our work self, or actually was there another self? And the reason I say that is because I can remember times when I'd put the phone down having spoken to someone, and then I'd be thinking, I'm not entirely sure I remember exactly what I just said. But then somehow this elephant of a memory that we've got, when I need to recall information, that one of us calls it our library, it just kind of like comes, so that causes confusion as to whether it's another self sometimes, because you think, well, I kind of know it, but how do I know it?
Right.
Yeah.
It's interesting being in the internal space, right? As a system of where did that information come from? How did I know that?
Yeah. And what gets shared in the common headspace and what doesn't. So yeah, going back to the journey then, that was 2016. And it took me a couple of years of really challenging times where I was then eventually, but maybe won't cover the whole journey to try and find an appropriate therapist, because that took me a long time, because the therapist I was with then had no idea about dissociation. I didn't know what I was dealing with. They didn't know what I was dealing with. They thought I was regressing. I even remember them saying to me something like, I really don't expect this kind of behavior from you, Amanda, because they obviously had no idea that I was switching, and neither did we.
I just had a visceral reaction to that.
Yeah. And it wasn't purposeful harming, but they had very little understanding. They weren't aware of dissociation. I've kind of found that out since, which is another one of our passions, isn't it? Collectively is how we get dissociation and DID onto kind of frameworks for further education. That's for another day. So yeah, eventually when we found somebody almost by chance that understood what we might be going through, it took us a couple of years of really difficult times. I was literally kind of chairing board meetings, fronting up, doing a very senior job, and going to therapy and literally picking myself up off the floor and going back to work. And eventually I had to stop work because my body, I now know I probably would have the clinical description of burnout, exhaustion. And it's a shame that it got to that. But so my work wasn't the cause directly necessarily, but it certainly exacerbated the challenges that I was facing. So yeah, we kind of eventually then went on sick leave, and then finally had to give up our job in order to focus on our healing, because the two just couldn't sit alongside each other.
It's relatable in so many ways. Work is such an interesting thing because I feel like it provides so many of us stability, but in order to have that stability, it's like you have to be working 70, 80 hours a week. And then at some point, your body's like, yeah, I'm done.
Yeah,
I can't do that anymore. And then
yeah,
what happens when you stop?
yeah. Yeah, and because it was a dissociative behavioral pattern, we all know that people turn to different things, not knowing actually that that actually what the cause of their issues are is trauma. We know a lot of addictions have their root in trauma, and now looking back, I was an alcoholic, but it wasn't intentional. I just had so much drive. Obviously, I was detached from my body. And I used to have people saying to me, how can you deal with so much stress? This was before I felt anything. I didn't
Yeah.
realize I wasn't feeling anything. So it was my body that told me. I wasn't actually feeling it, but then I realized that I was struggling to put one foot in front of the other. But also, when I look back, because I'm quite slight, our body is quite slight, and I used to say to people that I'm feeling really ill, but I wasn't doing any exercise. I wasn't doing any at all, any form of self-care. I might have occasionally gone off to the odd spa treatment. But now, when I know and I look back at the state that my physical body was in, my breathing was paradoxical, as in I wasn't breathing properly. My posture, my holding pattern was awful. I had muscle atrophy, headaches galore, insomnia, the list
Mhm.
goes on. And actually, that whole area of kind of physical wellness, when we think about the stabilization phase,
Yeah.
for me, that's been a big part of it, is getting my body physically well.
Which is not an easy undertaking when you've had a life of trauma.
No,
We just started this biomagnet stuff for various different issues. And the practitioner always says, yep, the issues are in your tissues.
yeah,
And
yeah,
whether it's emotional trauma store, there's so many things that our bodies just hold on to. And then it turns into various forms of illnesses and disease and unrest.
yeah. And I don't know about you, but before we started on this journey, I had no knowledge about things like that, issues in the tissues or our body keeps a score. I kind of just thought almost the overwork would have caused the issue.
Mhm.
But I didn't properly understand the extent to which, and still is the case, that our physical manifestation of trauma is such a huge part. And maybe this is an area that we can talk a bit about, because it's an area that I think in the kind of whole stabilization and safety area, there isn't much talk about the physical body, is there really?
Not really, unless I feel like unless somebody is going to talk about engaging in like somatic experiencing therapeutic
Yeah,
work or say or sensory motor therapeutic work. But I don't think that's also what we're talking about, right? We're talking about caring for the body and allowing the body to let go of some of
yeah.
the stuff that it's been holding on to.
Yeah. And I don't know about for you, but for us, because obviously breathing and full breathing, full diaphragmatic breathing, if for us really early on, and this, I don't want to put people off because it can get there much quicker, but it's probably taken me 8 years to learn how to breathe properly.
That makes sense.
And, because actually the whole allowing your body to feel your breath and being comfortable in your body took us so long, because we're so, upper chest breathing.
Yep.
And so, yeah, that whole area of kind of like the self-help that we all can do. But I've only really learned this. So, and that's where we like podcasts, because we can all share things, perhaps things that people can be doing themselves, even if they haven't got access to therapy.
So true and so important because so many people don't have access to therapy, but that doesn't mean that you can't make progress, that you can't improve your life, that you can't reach whatever it is that you'd like to reach in your life.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I can remember when I had to stop work, and I never used to walk anywhere. And I mean, I would walk from my car to my office. I didn't walk, and I used to think, well, what's the purpose of walking? Why do I need to go for a walk? If I'm going to go and buy something, I'll get in my car and go and buy it. And when I stopped work, it was like cold turkey. Sorry for people, I don't mean to kind of, not give full respect to people who have to go through other versions of that. But I was there. Imagine if you kind of got like a work self that works from the second you wake up in the morning at 5:30 or whatever through to goodness knows what hour of the lateness in the day or even the next morning, that my work stopped, and I mean stopped overnight. Yeah. And I had no support after that to actually then work out how to manage your day when you've been used to working to that level. I was just beyond, that actually I think was one of the most difficult things I had to face. So in the end, I had to give myself a reason to go, because I was just going stir crazy. And all I do is I walk to the shop, and I give myself a reason to walk to the shop. That's how bad I was. I just didn't see a reason to walk. And if you compare that now 8 years later, and I run 3 times a week, for example, but to start with, it was I need to walk to the shop to go and buy a pint of milk or something.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's huge. It's huge.
When you're talking about that too, it made me think about how so many of us are not even connected to the physical body at all.
No,
Whether you're, if just even something like learning how to breathe, first you have to be aware that you are breathing. And when
yeah,
you're living literally from like the chin up, you are not aware of any of that.
I was definitely a neck up. In fact, when I had the kind of assessment for burnout, and I mean my cortisol levels were literally off the chart. They kind of were off the chart, and but I had no sense of hunger, thirst. I used to breath hold. In fact, we still do breath hold a lot. And yes, so I had no idea where my breath was. You're right, is that the first thing was actually, for those of you listening to a podcast, I'm now looking down at my body. I have to actually, even now, sometimes look at my physical self, touch myself, like on my leg and slap, in order to know where a part of me is in space.
Yeah.
And so back then it was way, 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 way worse, way worse. So yeah, it was really about rebuilding my whole structure of what does a day look like, going back then. Yeah, and then there was, how do I get therapy if that's the route that I wanted to go down, which I then had a challenge obviously to finance that because of the challenges we have with the NHS here in the UK to get therapy funded. But I did two things going alongside one another. I paid for therapy because I was in employment before I stopped work. So I was able then to kind of afford to pay for it. And at the same time, then I started a journey of trying to build a case to get funding through the National Health Service for my therapy. And then, cut a very long story short, but I had to move counties, and I then had to start all over again because it's a different geography. So yeah, for a while I have been, for quite a lot of my journey, I've funded my own therapy, and now we're in a different space, but that could always change. And it's one of the things, maybe again we can talk about another day, which is the different infrastructures we have in different countries around how you get or don't get treatment. But
Yeah.
I guess what I'd like others to know is actually the amount of stuff that we do, which is outside of the therapy room, and give hope to those people that can't get therapy. That's one of our passions, I guess, one of our desires.
I think it's so important when you think about therapy, it's 60 minutes,
Yeah,
depending on where you are. Maybe you'll get a 90-minute session and maybe you'll have therapy more than once a week. But for most people, it's an hour a week.
yeah,
And that leaves a lot of hours outside of that therapy session anyway, right? So, and what are some things that are helpful if you are a system?
yeah. And also I think for some people, I hear from those I talk with that some can't physically face reading anything about DID, whether that's because of denial or whether it's just something else in them that just doesn't feel right. We're kind of the opposite, other than the fact that for trigger reasons, we can't physically open a physical book, but we learn from online and we want to know kind of everything, which actually has its challenges because our capacity to keep going, we have to remind ourselves to stop. But yeah, the education around psych education, around understanding what's happening when our front brain goes offline.
Yep.
And that's where people like Carolyn Spring in the early days really, really, really helped us to understand what is happening when we're triggered, what is happening in our brain, because for us as a system, we like knowledge, we like understanding why something is happening.
Yeah.
So we've spent a lot of time reading, listening to podcasts, YouTube videos from a range of people, like people with lived experience, clinicians, people that have got lived experience and are therapists and or training people. So that for us is a big part of what we do outside of the therapy room, a big part of that to help ourselves to kind of better understand what it is that we're facing, really.
And it's such a gift in so many ways that those things are accessible online as long as you have a smartphone, a library nearby, or some way to get online. You can
Yeah,
typically find some of these resources to learn from versus, you know, 20, 30 years ago,
yeah.
you had to go to the library and there's like a book, you know?
And I've heard, those people who've perhaps learned about the DID later in life, or they were around in the sort of 80s and 90s, and like, oh my goodness, call out to just shout out to everyone like that, because I can't imagine now trying to face what we're facing without some fantastic resources. And, we'll give a shout out to some of those people at some point here, because we are so, so, so grateful for some of those resources. But yeah, we talked before about this challenge about finding out later in life,
Yeah.
because we can be quite discerning about. So one of the benefits, I guess, of the fact that we're reasonably wise now and we can discern between good information and bad information.
Yep.
Maybe some of that comes with maturity, I don't know, but actually learning about DID so late in life, we need other role models that have actually had similar experiences, be that whether you learn when you're a teenager or even younger, or whether you don't get to find out until later in life. And what's great as a community is we've got lots of people doing great things at different stages of their lives. Because for us, finding out, when we did, was massive. It's just like our identity just went overnight, as in disappeared almost.
Yeah. I'm thinking about when Mike Lloyd was on episode 13, I think it was, and he was talking about the grief.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean that we took that one to therapy because oh boy, did that hit us in the, really hit us in our heart. It was towards the end. For anybody listening, please listen to the whole podcast episode because it was great. But it's towards the end, and we actually took that to therapy because it was almost like a thank you to acknowledge the layers of grief. And we really struggle with that in terms of both vulnerability and also other allies, friends, family, recognizing that these layers of grief that we've got, like some of ourselves are grieving the loss of our dog here and now, when actually we lost our dog when we were 17.
Mm.
And so that was more than 35 years ago. But they're experiencing the grief now because we didn't have the feelings at the time. So there's grief for the identity that's lost and all the things that you didn't do or you didn't have or you didn't know or you didn't know that you didn't have.
Yes. Yep.
And then there's when you actually start accessing those feelings and emotions held in your other selves, boy, is the grief exhausting. It is exhausting, isn't it?
Yeah. It's deep too, right? That there's also the grief of wondering what could have been.
Oh yeah, oh yeah, yeah. And we've had a sadly we've had a divorce recently, and so with our ex-husband, one of our challenges in one of ourselves is grieving what we didn't do in that marriage because she's grieving the loss of not having a child. We never had a child. We'd never given birth to a child. But the realization for her as a kind of teenager, she's an age slider, that actually we will never have a child because the body is now not old enough. We're post menopause. But she's grieving the loss of not having had a child, and she's had phantom pregnancies as one of our symptoms. So the complexity around grief in the selves, let alone the actual trauma and the issues that come with attachment.
Oh, yeah.
The attachment stuff is really hard, really, really, really hard.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
sometimes a lot of times that doesn't get enough airtime. Really understanding the attachment wounds that happened
yeah,
when we were all so, so young and how that is intricately and probably permanently connected to being a system.
yeah. And I don't know whether this happens for you or for we've heard others talk about it, that because, as you were saying earlier, that many of these issues don't have narrative. And so that doesn't help us with the denial either, because, we've been through a process now over 3 years with our current therapist where there are some things that we wouldn't allow ourselves to accept because we didn't have an inverted commas evidence. Yeah.
Right.
And so now it isn't until now where we've got patterns of behavior from other selves, dates and patterns of flashbacks. We call them trauma dreams, when these flashbacks come at night, sometimes for the first time, and all these other pieces of information that we're kind of like, oh yeah, but we can't tell you the story of X, Y, and Z. Yet we might have body memories, things happen on specific dates or at specific times of the year, or all those other things that we can all, I'm sure, identify with for those of us with particular trauma histories. And but then the adult me, the kind of the thinking part is kind of like, oh yeah, 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 but we can't tell the story about it. But of course, it's all pre-verbal.
Yes.
So yeah, I'm trying to track back as to why I said that now, but I think it was around the issues of really trying to understand where the grief and the attachment issues come from.
It's one of the many layers, right, of
Yeah,
the grief, especially later in life.
yeah, 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 and yeah. So when we talk about this sort of 3 phases of therapy, going back to the journey thing, like if anyone are kind of, I'm one of these people who's like, okay, well, tell me what to do and I'll do it. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's sort of very task orientated. And my therapist spent quite a lot of time saying, but Amanda, it's not going to quite work like that.
Isn't that annoying?
Yeah, 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 yeah. I wish it did. I wish it did. But actually,
Right.
all these grounding techniques that we read about, we need them to be age specific. And you talked about this in your last one about developing internal communication and what you need to do before you start kind of going into those realms. Because what's going to help if we're triggered, obviously, if it's before you're triggered, you can try regulating your body and know what that feels like, and learn distress tolerance and everything. But if a young part is triggered, and we're not co-conscious, by the way, then they need techniques for grounding that is going to help a 2-year-old, is going to help a 9-year-old. And some of them are in terms of upregulated, some of them are downregulated. So some of them need panic attacks, need grounding for panic attacks and anxiety. And another part might need upregulating because they collapse in a sort of catatonic state. And, so boy, how do you ground and get stabilization with all these various different nervous states, in terms of autonomic nervous states, I mean.
Yep. Especially if you don't have any way of communicating to other parts, because you can have a part that's a great planner, right? That says, okay, I'm going to make sure that I always have this thing in my pocket. I'm just going to make
Yeah,
this up for purposes of illustration. I'm always going to have some kind of like silly putty or Play-Doh for a younger part, that's how that part could actually get back into the present by feeling something in the here and now. And then I'm going to have like an anxiety ring, those things that spin,
Yeah,
that to help another part that maybe is like 13. And then I'm going to have, you can think of all these things that you can kind of always have with you. But if the parts don't know they're there and don't know when to reach for them, it doesn't
exactly.
matter that they're there.
No, no. And actually, the podcast I keep referring to, it's because it's fresh in my mind. I listened to it the other day. Is we get quite hard on ourselves about the lack of co-consciousness, and we're trying to work out whether some of that is shame induced, as in me not being able to accept how vulnerable and what we're like when we switch to a young part, for example, because that takes quite a lot for a 57-year-old to accept
Mm-hmm.
how we might behave in those younger states. So there's that. Some of it might be around our birth name, about whether the other selves will accept someone who identifies with our birth name. We don't know. It could be all sorts of reasons why there's a block on co-consciousness. It could be that it's not safe yet, it's not right yet, but it also might just be because I'm not doing the right things to reach out. And one of the things that I'd encourage other people to go and listen is that I then give myself a hard time about it. But actually, I am getting communication. I'm just probably not calling it that.
Yeah.
Yeah, which you talked about, didn't you?
Yes. Because I think so many people, when we talk about communication, are anticipating that there will be an immediate, almost like verbal conversation within the head space. And that is not how all parts communicate.
No, no.
Even when you can recognize it, there's so many different sensory sensations. For some people who visualize, they'll see that cravings, urges, so many things.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, there's so many things. And so you were saying about like if you start to sense something that is almost like passive, a passive influence, or I can't remember if you called it that, but or a feeling sense in your body, to use that as a really good example, what happens with us is that what other people might encourage you, and certainly our therapists would encourage us to say, is to say out loud, okay, I'm sensing that someone's anxious and this and this and this. Yeah. Now I can say that to you now. If I started to use the rest of our names and actually try and communicate that to an inside part, we almost immediately would switch because of the self-compassion.
Mm.
So by giving ourselves that self-compassion is a feeling of not being safe. So the irony is that in order for me to almost co-parent and let the rest of me know that I'm here and I'm listening, when I turn my attention to doing that, I actually then get distressed from the self-compassion and switch anyway. So I then can't keep that edge of co-consciousness because the self-compassion feels alien to ourselves, and then we dissociate.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. I mean, it reminds me of parts of self that honestly can't tolerate joy
Yeah, yeah,
and can't tolerate that sense of, yes, love and compassion. For different reasons, right? Some people have never had it
yeah,
and it does feel really foreign. Other people are scared to experience it because they're afraid it's going to disappear again. And the disappearance of it would be far more painful than never knowing it to start with.
yeah.
And then when you've had experiences also of, whether it was by accident or by design,
Mm-hmm.
a therapist or provider shaming you around a behavior,
Yeah, yeah,
not
yeah,
even a behavior, but like switching basically.
yeah,
All of those things come together in this tangled up ball of confusion that make it really hard.
yeah. Yeah, and or as we know, there'll be plenty of people that will know that often those kind of behaviors from people that I'm not necessarily saying this is our experience because actually we haven't uncovered, there's so much we need to uncover, which is just not happening yet. There's about dissociative barriers are enormous for us. But if others externally have shown you, sort of what might be perceived as love and affection, and then that's, just turned around into not being that. So we don't quite know yet, but we try really, really, really hard. But actually, I'm trying to work out what is it that I need to do in order to build that. Or is it simply the fact that we're not ready yet? But I'm thinking, well, crikey, I say it's been a long time, but we've had so many external life events thrown at us that's another thing. You can go into therapy and then find that your life situation, as in the present life situation, throws so many challenges at you that all you can do is survive, which is kind of where we've been.
Yes.
In recent years, and then we give ourselves a hard time for not making progress in therapy. So that's really challenging. Yeah, and you talked, I often then also have a little bit of when people talk about their inner world,
Mm-hmm.
and we're kind of like, wow, wouldn't it be great to have somewhere we can all hang out inside? We don't have an inner world, or we haven't got one that we've discovered, and also we can't visualize. So a lot of the grounding techniques are kind of, or the typical textbook grounding techniques are not available to us because we can't visualize safe spaces and things like that.
Yeah.
And so that whole thing around amnesia, I think we talked about this once before, was around what we think of as amnesia, again, tends to be focused on narrative,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, or time. Whereas actually we've got visual amnesia.
Yeah. Do you want to say a little more about that? Because I feel like there are people out there that that's going to resonate for, and they've never heard of it before.
Yeah. I mean, there is a name for it for people that experience it that maybe don't have trauma, which is called aphantasia. So it's the lack of ability to be able to capture an image in your mind's eye. And we didn't know that we didn't have it until things like when people would say to us, like on a running route, somebody says, oh, well, you just visualize when you go here, and we're kind of like, nope. We can't build pictures in our mind's eye, in our head. What we do seem to have, I suppose it's a bit like when any sense gets heightened, what we do have is we remember layouts.
Mhm.
So like, a layout of a room, what's on the left, what's on the right. But we can't visualize, so therefore we can't visualize safe spaces. We haven't got any visual picture of any inner world, so we can't create safe spaces in the inner world. But what's really interesting, we can't have full aphantasia, because when we have flashbacks, mainly when they come at nighttime, boy, do they come with visual detail. So it's interesting that it must be a protective amnesia. So again, it's something that the brain isn't yet safe to remember, and it only comes out in our sleep time. Yeah, when our brain is obviously in a different state. So yeah, that's quite frustrating, actually. Well, very frustrating.
Yeah.
And so yeah, it's just to let others know that if people are talking about these visual experiences to try and help grounding, or when you're trying to recall things, we don't have visual recollection. We have visual amnesia.
Are there things that do work for you for grounding that you find you can rely on for just some type of settling or centering?
Yeah, and this comes back to what we were saying about other selves, because we've almost got selves that switch in the therapy room to upregulate. Now, so the thing that helps us, I think, even if it's me or anyone, see any of the rest of me, seems to be movement. In other words, whether that's walking, whether it's rocking, whether it's tapping, whether it's just, a slight tap on our face, we seem to need sensory input. In fact, we've got a lot of sensory issues, a lot, to the extent where we think there's maybe some comorbid stuff going on. So lots and lots and lots. So for us, it seems to be not imagine a safe space or visualize a safe space. We need sort of physical contact with the ground or with movement. That's what seems to help us the most. So yeah, but one of our challenges as well is that even when we're at home, I don't lose time as such. And the reason I don't lose time is because I suppress switching, because I'm not co-conscious, and because I worry about other selves being on their own.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got this sort of slight battle with the only time our other selves have time to express is in the therapy room. And therefore, that's the only time they get to practice grounding techniques. is with somebody else to help them because I'm not yet co-conscious. So it limits what I can learn outside of the therapy room.
And it's interesting though, because at the same time, if the parts are coming forward in the therapy room, it sounds like they're trying to be really careful to make sure that you're all safe enough
Yeah,
rather than sort of taking the risk, if you will, of just switching in and out.
yeah, yeah. And we also have a big challenge around being seen and heard. So where we live, we would really, really, really worry. I mean, beyond, we would almost need to plan for a scream because we are so worried about being overheard. Really, even in the therapy room, we're really worried about being overheard. So it's a big challenge for us to let go. And as such, we can't get in touch with our anger either.
That makes so much sense because, I mean, anger is such an active emotion. You know, it's not one that's easy to hide either from facial expressions or a lot of times to express anger, right? People want to do something angry or active rather, can't talk.
Yeah,
You know, Adrian and co on their lives sometimes have talked about different parts of them that would go to smash rooms,
yeah,
you know, to get some of that rage out in a safe, healthy way. And other people will use physical activity, running, kickboxing classes, or just boxing in general. But if you aren't even able to tap into it
yeah,
for safety reasons, right? It's all kind of bottled up and stuck.
yeah. So what happens? Running is a really good example because we now run and we're members of a club. But if we get to a point where we're getting like puffy, you know, like really pushing ourselves in order to try and metabolize some of that energy, we get so close to a switch because it's another self. There's one part that holds on almost to the physical movement active sort of energy. He's around 9 and he wants to run and he wants to kind of move our body. And then there's another self that actually holds on to the despair and the resentment and everything else, the kind of real depressive mood state. But he can't move the body. He's only head upwards. And so he's the one that holds anger, but he needs access to other people who are other selves who are upregulated to physically move the body to get metabolize the anger. But if we start trying to feel that when we're running, if we're thinking like, oh, yeah, I could really shake this out or do physical exercise, I then get switchy
Mm-hmm.
and I can't then allow that to fully be expressed because I'll be a 9-year-old boy.
Right. Right.
Yeah. And then we're like, we're going to get rejected. We're not going to be understood. How do I explain to my running buddies that they're going to be 1 minute running with me, Amanda, and our other self, who is 9, is very different to me.
Yep.
He speaks differently. He holds his body differently, I'm told by a therapist. I've heard him. And he's just like a 9-year-old boy.
Well, because he is, right? That's what he is.
I have no idea. Yeah, as far as he's concerned, that's what he is. And if somebody started calling him by my name or whatever, then he would get distressed, and then that would probably trigger an even younger part. So it's like, so aside of the fact that my body can't actually improve our running too much because I have to be on this knife edge of
Yeah.
exhaustion, I'm also thinking, well, I can't really, even if I could push ourselves, then he'd be there like sprinting over the finish line. And also, he doesn't feel the pain.
Mm,
I've hurt my Achilles before because I have switched out to him, and I've hurt my Achilles because he just thinks he can run as fast as a 9-year-old would be able to run.
yeah.
So it's kind of like, yeah, metabolizing all of that is without being co-conscious is yeah, something I'm working on.
And these are the things that you don't read about in any of the
Yeah,
clinical type of literature that is readily available to people, right? The concept that you can suppress switching, that is a thing.
yeah, yeah,
Not everyone can do it. And then people who can do it can't do it all the time and will still have unexpected switches, not necessarily because they're triggered by trauma, but potentially triggered by a role or some other belief system or what. There's so many different things that go into
yeah,
switching that I think people don't understand.
yeah, yeah. And if we get, I know, and then that actually brings about what I would call real stigma. In that, we have the stigma that we all talk about as a community that we need help from our allies on with, media stigma and that sort of thing. But we've been on the receiving end of awful stigma
Yeah.
because other people have actually said to us, even somebody I knew as a friend for like 20 years, that actually, and this was someone that had met other selves, that had been out for days with other selves, that actually got relationships with two or three of the rest of us. And because we were in survival mode, going through divorce and a house move and everything else that life has thrown away, and no longer having our stepchildren in our lives, no longer having our previous home, no end of things. And actually, because I had to suppress even more than I already did to the outside world, I'm an exhausted 57-year-old getting on with a divorce. I'm suppressing all of the switching because we're so overwhelmed and I've got so much adulting to do, with divorce papers and house moves and everything else. And actually, then our friend, so-called friend, has dropped our relationship of 20 plus years because she actually said, well, I think the words were something along the lines of, I think that your only selves or your other selves are only there now in order that you can claim your benefits.
Oh.
And that was simply because she'd known us switching, because she got to know other selves. She was a trusted person that we were very, very open with. And actually now that causes a lot of issue. We feel so, what's the word? I can't think about the word, but essentially really hurt, but there is a different word, violated almost, that we allowed them so close in our lives. And then the point at which we just had to do almost what we did as kids, which is just survive and me and stay in the adult body. Then they accused us, it's basically fake claimed us and ghosted us and dropped us over WhatsApp. That's real stigma.
That's horrible.
Isn't it?
Yes. And it speaks to so many things too, the complexities of trying to be in relationship with other people when you have multiple selves versus, if there were only one. It's just so complicated.
Yeah. And this thing about we've got a real drive for authenticity, that we always, wherever invited, because some people really don't want to hear the truth from us because we can be very truthful if invited and if given, we think that people will listen, then actually what that's now meant is that we're stuck because we can't be our true authentic selves, because to be our true authentic selves, other people would get to know. We're a system of, I haven't got another adult self as far as I'm aware, other than the one who seems to kind of know everything and he's just a thinker. He's just got the head body. So he can't truly operate as an adult in life. The rest of us, as discovered today, I hasten to add, because there could easily be more of us, are all younger selves. So I'm the only adult. But what I then feel is that there's another however much of us that people don't experience. We can't be authentic because we fear rejection, because our lived experience is rejection.
Yeah.
Our lived experience is that
Yeah.
the identity that we had as our work self, we no longer have the vast majority of our work friends. Our experience is that what was our family, husband, stepchildren, and others, now essentially have no contact with us because we were really desperately trying to be authentic and let the outside world know what our real selves are, including being on national radio. And it wasn't, we were at the end of the day, we've been rejected for trying to be authentic. So then do we just be only me? Well, all I do is I just do.
Right.
I don't hold emotion yet. The rest of me hold the colourful aspects, maybe of and the trauma, of course. So yeah, it's a real challenge to say, well, it's almost like those of us with DID have to keep starting over all the time. We have to keep starting over.
Yep. It's interesting you say that. I can look back over my own life and think of multiple times of having to start over. And
Yeah.
there's some, not all of it, but some of it is this lack of education and awareness about what DID is, what it looks like, that it is prevalent. It's not rare, as we've all been sort of brainwashed to think for many years. So people never expect to see it, or they decide if they do see it that you've got to be lying, that it's not
Yeah.
your authentic self somehow.
Yeah.
But also, people tend to bond over these sort of shared developmental milestones in life. And
Mm.
it's really challenging to do that when you're a system.
Yeah.
Some of your firsts have been incredibly horrible and traumatic.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then we've talked about this previously a couple of times, right? Like sharing life circumstances seems to overwhelm other people. You get just a little bit into what your life is like, and they're completely overwhelmed, and you haven't even really scratched the surface.
Yeah. Yeah. And we've asked ourselves so many times when we've wondered why people are shying away from us. And there are plenty who come forward, I hasten to add as well. So this isn't to, for anyone out there who is actively being alongside us in our journey, thank you. Thank you. A big thank you. So this isn't to say that everyone rejects us. But, if we're in a situation where we can't be real and we can't be true to ourselves, then what we're really looking for in terms of awareness is, I often think, okay, well, what is it that I would really love to see other people doing that I perhaps don't feel supported in?
Mm,
And a lot of that is around sharing in our awareness building,
yeah.
because for us to have other people say, almost to feel a sense of pride that we went on national radio, that we are open and out with DID. Because if we don't do that, firstly, it makes our lives really, really difficult to be accepted in society and to have a purpose and a place. And other people with, be that disabilities, be that with neurodivergence, be that with differences of any nature, people that feel marginalized for any reason will want that sense of belonging in society and therefore fitting in. Yeah. But if we don't even get the support to help people acknowledge why people have DID,
Mm,
what that means for our everyday lives, and show us that support by just, imagine a situation where you have a big fundraising campaign actually done by allies,
yeah.
that is a bit like other people raise funds for, initiatives where they've been personally in their lives, they've been affected by something.
Yeah.
So yeah, we would really hope that changes, but often, sadly, it takes something really bad to happen for people to feel that they are comfortable with sharing things about mental health or suicide or something like that. And sadly, it takes a life lost or something really bad to happen. But what could be possibly, so many atrocities that go on, but what we're really talking about here are traumatized
Yep.
children. Yeah. What we're building awareness of is to try and build awareness and spot the red flags so that less children are traumatized, stroke abused, stroke neglected.
Yes.
And that's what we're looking for. If to help for us now, for those of us living with the ID where we have no choice but to face recovery, but to actually get behind something which is about making a better life for future generations, what's not to get behind?
Throughout the whole lifespan, if we can prevent children from being harmed, and also for those who have already been harmed, can we get them help
Yeah,
so that, people aren't finding out that they're a system when they're 80?
yeah, yeah. So even if people can't, exactly, even if people don't feel that they can identify with a 57-year-old woman who's got traumatized children inside us,
Mhm.
then please think of a little toddler wandering around, struggling in life. And, they need care, they need people to spot what's going on. And often they're copers, these little ones. They're not always people with overt behavior difficulties. They're often the copers, aren't they, that people don't spot. Certainly that would be the case for us, that people wouldn't have spotted us, being going through difficulties because we were just a coper.
Yep. Quiet, trying to do everything right.
Yeah. And the thought of, I mean, just imagine that we would be able to get the kind of help where when we get to actually the real nitty gritty work of trauma processing, whatever that looks like, and once we've got past the stabilization, the developing internal communication, and all of that sort of thing, and actually then start to experience the horrendous stuff that we all do in our, flashbacks, body memories, and so on. Imagine being able to be almost looked after. What would that, imagine what that would feel like to be looked after, like you can get looked after in a hospital, or, that somebody brings you grapes for the hard work that you're doing in therapy.
It's such a foreign idea, but it would be so lovely, wouldn't it?
Yeah, to be treated with parity
Yeah.
is, I guess, what we're really saying. But then, we can think of that now as adults, but imagine those little children.
Yeah.
Imagine all of us as little children, where for whatever reason, whatever was going on for any of us wasn't spotted. So that's kind of really where, if I could change anything, the passion around awareness building is around changing the future for the children.
Absolutely. I think about
Yeah.
the impetus behind basically this podcast, the account, the Substack is right, is can
Yeah.
we get that information out there in our case for people who are already struggling, who, you know, don't know.
Yeah.
And they're looking for something that's relatable so that maybe somebody can listen and say, wait, that's something that I experienced. Maybe I can explore this avenue. And so much respect for all the work that you're doing to prevent it from the beginning, right? How young can we intervene so that
Yes.
this stuff isn't happening to the vulnerable children in the world?
Yeah. And one of the things when I've been kind of doing a bit of research around that, if anything that all of us are doing is kind of focusing on adults living with a complex dissociative disorder, that actually then I was wondering, well, what about the children? And I was pleased to find out that there is actually a someone in the UK, and maybe we can end up linking to this in podcast notes or something, but there is actually someone who is specifically looking at trauma and dissociation as a charity in young children in the UK, which even I wasn't aware of until recently. So that's great news, because it means then that I don't feel that we're kind of leaving that area undone.
Mm,
I mean, obviously,
yeah.
there's so much work to do. But then if we can collectively, build alliances, do the stuff that we're doing, across continents, across countries, globally, to make information and just feel a sense of community and give hope, because we know that generally our health systems and society aren't there yet. I mean, it would be great to think we can get to a point where, this help is available through,
Yeah.
through society. But until such time, then, that's why we're doing the work that we're all doing, in terms of advocacy and podcasts
Yeah.
and so on. But it takes a lot for all of us to be doing this when you're kind of managing life with DID or another complex dissociative disorder anyway.
I'm no one can see me, but I'm nodding vigorously. Yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
What are some of your favorite resources that are out there for folks?
Yeah, this is eventually when so we've chatted to you before about the fact that we're a future trustee of what will be the Dissociative Disorders Alliance, which will be we hope
Yeah.
will be a registered charity here in the UK, and eventually we'll get to a point where we're signposting to many of the brilliant resources that exist globally, because there's so many of them. But for now, the things I can talk about that have helped us in more recent times, podcasts and lives, people like yourselves, people like an infinite mind, Adrian, as there's so much we can identify with when Adrian Fletcher's put stuff out. Other than that, we also really like Dr. Mike Lloyd and the CTAG clinic,
Yeah.
because we love the fact that he's behind us as a clinician and as a clinic, as well as actually taking time out to help educate on all sorts of different levels,
Yeah.
both for clinicians, for therapists, and for people with lived experience. Also, Teresa Dutcher has been like a massive part of our learning. They've got a website from memory, I think it's dis-sos.com. Carolyn Spring, I've already kind of given a shout out to. Beauty After Bruises
Yeah.
have been a huge, their resources on Facebook in particular. And yeah, so, and many more when Twitter was kind of a bit more alive, there's all sorts of systems that in our darker times we reached out and said, is there anyone out there, please? And, some people offer coaching, we've kind of tapped into. But yeah, and also people that offer, interestingly, we've started to follow a lot of child psychologists and child um, uh, people that help kids with sensory needs and with regulation. So we actually follow quite a lot of people that are helping young children to regulate their emotions on social media. And Dr. Ariel Schwartz as well, who does a lot of work on polyvagal theory and nervous system regulation. We've learned so much from her. Oh, honestly, we spend so much of our time learning from others and are so grateful for everyone that also puts out podcast material like yourselves and many others, which is great to see so many of them coming out, with, and also therapists
Yeah.
with, and clinicians with lived experience as well is just so valuable.
We'll definitely link all of those resources in the show notes along with a bio and your social media account so that people can find you and follow you.
Thank you. Yeah, and the Dissociative Disorders Alliance, we're kind of doing so much background work, and it might seem to everyone like it's a long time coming, but we need to build so much safety, and also the Charity Commission in the UK. There's lots and lots of kind of hoops we have to jump through, and policies and procedures, which rightly so, we need to feel really safe for the community. But we can put the web address with your permission in the kind of in the notes so that at least everyone can sign up to keep informed about about our journey and when we finally get registered.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because apart from it, there's so many people that are also trying to strive for justice as well. That the whole legal system, as we know, isn't set up for people to share what actually happened to them and then get justice for it. And so the more information that's online
Mm-hmm.
means that the web, the internet gets populated with real lived experience of people so that it isn't just kept under wraps, because that's a lot of the issue, that many of these atrocities don't get the light of day because they're not carried to full justice because of our justice system.
Oh gosh, that's
Whereas
so true.
if there were, there would be lots more media coverage and so on.
I feel like we have to do a part two because I know there's like
Yeah,
there's still so much stuff that we had talked about that I think will be
yeah.
great for people to hear. So I'm going to be begging you to come back.
Yeah, we'd love to get some feedback from, how people have received this. And
Yeah.
likewise, I'm kind of thinking of so much stuff that we've talked about and that we haven't talked about. So really,
I'm looking at the list next to me and I'm like, oh, but we didn't get to this or this. And I think it's all really rich, important stuff. And so,
and we really appreciate the opportunity, and it gives us so much kind of sense, and it is about sense of belonging, but also not being alone, that
yeah.
we can reach out like this over different countries, different time zones, and share our lived experience. That's kind of what keeps us going, really.
Yep. The connection is so important. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
I will be begging you to come back for sure.
Yeah, let's hope so. We'd certainly be up for that.
Yes.
Thank you.
And to everyone listening, thank you so much for being here today, for joining us in this conversation. We hope that you found things that are relatable, resources that can help you on your path to healing. And if you're a provider, we hope that you also found information and resources that can be helpful to you as you walk alongside your clients on their own unique journeys to healing. We know it is not an easy path as someone who walks it and also helps others walk the path. There are some pretty painful moments and some real challenges. And of course, there are some bright points. We are really, really blessed to be part of this incredible community, whether you are a system, a provider who is a system, or providers who are just working with folks who are systems. It is just a really, really special community. So again, thank you so much for being here, and let's keep healing. Thank you for tuning in. You can find our blog on Substack at healingmyparts.substack.com and on Instagram at healingmyparts. Just a disclaimer, any information shared in this podcast is not a substitute for professional therapy or behavioral health care, nor does listening to the podcast constitute a therapist-client relationship. Please be sure to take extra good care of you. And until next time, keep healing and thriving.